I was just outside in the Weft lobby looking at a poinsettia plant that has grown for a whole year. Came from the bank and we saved it, and it's now about 2 feet high. It's all green. It hasn't got the show of red that comes from having the right time frame for the light that falls on the plant. It needs a certain amount of shade or no light, and you can activate the poinsettia plant to do that, but it's it's still an interesting preservation of much of the greenery that gets to be salvaged over the season. Yeah, I'm sad to see the trees recycled. They provide habitat for creatures, but it also means that those plants have grown for several years and don't get utilized again. Some people regrow their trees, and that is pretty fancy. I like that. I have been at the market in the square inside with visuals and storylines about the prairie work that we do, and that continues to be an interesting thing to do. But some people go back to when we were producing silkscreens that had a relationship to nature. They were high contrast silkscreens that allowed you to put your own imagination into the scene. That barn may be the barn that you grew up with, that tree may be in the tree that you were working with. So last week we said something about the simple process of silkscreen printing, but this week I wanted to go into detail of silkscreen printing, because at this time of the year it becomes something where we share with other people. I want to set up a scene. What we do is try to relate to some situation. I was back in Australia for a while, and I had the opportunity to make silkscreen prints there. One of them is of a railroad pond which was being filled in. My immediate gut reaction was to be sad about that, because that pond had been in existence for perhaps best part of 100 years, and it had grown to be a vernal pond, a green pond that had its own ecology, and to take it out by filling it in with soil was not what I approved of. So I took a photograph of the tree and then proceeded to use that to promote the preservation of that pond. To put you into context, I have to give you the reason why I would think the way I was thinking, why there was a history to that pond, and it is that west of Sydney by about 40 or 50 miles, there is a tectonic lift of a range which is fairly sudden, and it has at the top of that range there is a plateau, and the people were beginning to get up there and settle. There was a convict road. You have to remember that Australia was initiated by convicts that couldn't come to America in 1796 or 7, and so to get over this range was quite a challenge. Eventually, people did get over the range and onto the slopes on the other side, but they needed to get up there, and my people lived at the top of that first plateau. There was another plateau further west that had to be accomplished too, and the road was Old Bathurst Road. Bathurst was one town that was on the plains, slopes to the west, and Old Bathurst Road was a very windy road. It had zigzags. Zigzags are when you go back and forth, and you have hairpin bends, and you get up to the peak of the ridge. It was a road that was very stony. It was traversed by oxen, and it was not an easy accomplishment, but people had made it. Today there are modern roads that have replaced it, but the old Bathurst Road is still there, and my people lived on it. Go back to getting access. By now you have people living there, and this was probably the best part of 100 years ago. Railroads had been established, but they hadn't yet got up onto that plateau. And it's an interesting plateau. You can look over Sydney and see, on a clear day, you can see the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So there's a flat land. And once again, the principle of a zigzag was used. The zigzag means that you line up a line of railroad track that's long enough to take a train, plus an introductory amount of space so that the train could be pushed up to or pulled up to a new level. Often a pusher engine was put on the back that would push the train up and over to a new level. That new level would have a long approach, and the train could move back and get speed up to go to an additional level. And if you kept doing this all the way up the face of the escarpment, you would eventually get to the top. By the time you got to the top, the steam engine was without water. So in order to accommodate that situation, a stream was dammed, and that was the pond that I was looking at, and I knew the history. The railroad has long since got through that escarpment using tunnels and a more modern railroad. So this zigzag is a historic place, and the zigzag enabled the railroad to get up onto the plateau and service a growing population of people. There were explorers, Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson that had managed to get over that mountain range, and my people lived at Blaxland, named after one of the explorers, Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson. So I looked at this as I do the prairie in east central Illinois, and looked at this one sentinel gum, a eucalyptus tree, a tall eucalyptus tree that was growing on the edge of the pond, surrounded by a series of tandem truck dumps of soil. And I thought this pond deserves some accreditation, both locally and at the state level, as a historic monument. So then I want to tell you about how we would go into making a silkscreen print of that sentinel gum. There's a lot of background to it. I had been silkscreening in east central Illinois for quite a while, so I had a background in this and had some help from people who loaned me darkroom space. And so I took a color photograph with old-time photography, took that to a darkroom and converted it to a black and white, and also converted it to a high contrast image. By this time I'd pulled it up to about a 16 by 20, a fairly large print, and or potential print, and created a negative. You can do a one-shot image, which is what we've done with prints previously, with T-shirts, and sometimes with dresses. We've got hand bags that have images on either side that have been one-shot silkscreen prints. In the case of the sentinel gum, I thought we could do a little better than that. Not that it's better, it's just different. But you can do a process called posterization. You take 3 images from that original photograph. One is overexposed, and that you'll make for a background. One is going to do the details, a medium exposure or the most correct exposure. And one is overexposure to just get the high spots. When you print those 3 different images on top of each other. So background you make in a perhaps a gray or a light brown. It's a background. Then you print on top of that the details in a slightly more dramatic color. It might be a very strong gray or a strong brown or even some other color. Then you print again on the top of that with the details. the highlights. That involves working with the silkscreen process. And even though the computer era has meant that it's much easier to make these sorts of images and everyone can do it in their own way, it's still, silkscreen printing is a process that is used a lot. It runs from being very simple with a child printing a very simple screen that might have a house and a tree and a bird and a landscape, to something highly sophisticated. If you make that posterization process so detailed, you can make 5 or 8 prints and you can almost return to a photograph. So then you have defeated your purpose of having a high contrast silkscreen print into which the viewer can put their own imagination. So we stop at 3 images. They have to be registered so that you don't have the 3 images looking like a poorly printed comic strip or something like that. So let's go through the printing process. We have done it next door from Weft for years. It involves creating a press, a printing press, fairly primitive in style, and we still have that press in the back room of Weft. We have not been doing that lately, partially because we've been doing other preservation work, but partially also because in the era of perhaps 30 years ago, we were using volatile materials, and we these days are very cautious about volatile materials, so our indoor press, if we had our druthers, would be taken to a warehouse where we could print with more safety. So that the press is still there. Let's look at the press. It's a table. It has a flat surface on it, a very smooth surface. But underneath the surface there's a vacuum. You make your surface that you want to print on just high enough that you can put a ordinary vacuum cleaner onto the area, and it can suck down paper so the paper stays in the right position. So that undersurface has little holes in it that allow the vacuum to hold the paper. You have a mechanism for hinging your silkscreen frame. The silkscreen frame may be 36 by 40 or something like that, and it needs to be held. So you have a hinge which locks onto that print, and it can be raised up. You can raise the frame up by having a little leg that is on the level of the print table. But that's awkward. You have to have octopus hands to do that and to let it down onto the print. So you have a pedal, and you have your frame attached to a pulley with a weight on the end of it, so that you don't really have to lift very hard to get the frame up. So we have a vacuum and a pedal, and then we're prepared to squeegee across that visual. We haven't made the visual yet, so and we also have linen lines where the prints are hung to dry when the ink is wet. Come back now to the photograph. We have exposed the photograph, and we're going to block the pores of the silkscreen. The silkscreen is made of coarse silk. The principle is that you block that silk in some manner. You can do it by hand by blocking it with a glue. If you're clever enough to work with a brush and glue, that can be rather nice. It can also be blocked photographically. There's you have to imagine that by this time we have a negative, which is probably 16 by 20 in size, and we have three negatives: overexposed, medium exposed, and underexposed. So those negatives have to be registered when we print. So one of the essential parts of the silkscreen machine is to have registration, little raised areas so that the paper can always go into the same place. We take that 16 by 20 negative and put it on top of a photosensitive gelatin. This is a gelatin that will eventually come up and through the pores of the silk and lock onto each side of the silk. We expose that to light in something like an enlarger, where light shines through the negative onto the photosensitive material. The photosensitive material is carried by a clear plastic, which keeps it together. You have to imagine that if you're going to print the letter E, it's sitting there by itself, and if you don't have a connector like you do with a stencil, then it's going to fall off if you don't have that carrying plastic. Once you have the carrying plastic, you then have to transfer it to the silkscreen. Let's go back to the silkscreen now. You have to have a frame, usually a fairly substantial frame. It looks like a normal picture frame, but it's especially designed to be pretty substantial. You turn it upside down, and then you take your bolt of silk and you cut off the amount you need, and then you stretch it onto that screen. You do that starting at the middle. So you have a stapler, and you hit on one side, and then on the other side, and you do that on all four sides. So you start, and you can put your hand on the piece in the middle, and it's nice and tight, and so gradually you move out along each side, taking each side in turn, and eventually you have a silk spread across that frame. Now you prune off the excess silk that you didn't need. You actually have a pair of pliers that are well designed to do this, so that you can pull that silk so it doesn't have loose areas in it that don't print very well. So and then you turn it over, and you're ready to insert that frame with its silk into the photosensitive product that is basically gelatin. The one we used a lot was, the commercial name was Ulano, and we have it on when it's damp, it will activate like gelatin, and you push your silk into that, and it comes up through the silk and locks on. You still have the carrying plastic that keeps all the imagery together. You let that dry, and then very carefully and with a few prayers, you remove the plastic carrier, and you're left with the image on the silk. Now, this is where the photosensitivity comes in. You wash that silk screen, and where the light has hit, it destroys the photosensitivity of the gelatin, and it falls off. So you're left with a silk screen with an image that you can print through. And once again, you let it dry, and you now have to turn the silk screen over and block it off. You have to imagine that you not only have an image of a tree, but you have areas around it that if you have an ink, they would come out and print on your paper too. So you block it off with paper or tape that is resistant to the ink we use, and that you have to be careful that there's no leaking points, so that silk screen is ready to go. Now we have to have ink, and the ink has to be the color that you would want, the consistency you would want. If you are going to print, you need to have the ink just at the right level so that you can squeegee across it, and it's not too thick so it fills in the pores, or it's not too thin so it gets to run through and make an ugly print. So ink is important. Then paper is also important. We used to use a Strathmore paper that was had a little tooth to it, and you had to know which way the tooth ran, and so there's a whole specialty of using papers. You can use a very shiny paper, which gives you a more dramatic look, or you can use a soft paper that gives you a sort of softer image. We also have to have that linen line that's ready to accept the prints. You can, if you're an expert at this, do the whole process yourself. But it's much more fun and interesting to have a team of people, so that you have people who select the paper, put it in. The paper person has to put their hand on the paper and swing it around very slowly but firmly, and that separates the sheets of paper so that you, in a hurry, you can grab the sheet of paper and you don't grab 3 sheets at once. You can select it. So that paper person can put the paper into the frame. You remember we have a frame hinged to the table deck with a vacuum underneath. So you can have a team of people doing this, and the first person in the team is the person handling the paper and putting it in. The person has to put that paper in with the little chocks that allow the paper to be registered the same position all the time. Because we're going to print this print 3 times. And the first time is okay, you get a print, and there's no problem with registration. But the next time the print has to go in exactly at that registration. And the vacuum has to be pulled to make sure that it stays in place. So then you drop the screen, and you the print master is more in charge than most. The ink is applied to the side of the printing press that's away from the person. So he's going to put his squeegee into that and squeegee across. So he needs to be able to move his shoulders back as he moves that squeegee across. So now let's take a break to see what we do with the squeegee. The squeegee is very important. It's the width of the silk screen, and it has you can put both of your hands on it. It has a little nail in one corner that allows you to put it down on a rest place when you are finished doing a screen. You have to sharpen that squeegee. If you have been doing runs with the squeegee, the sharp edge of the rubber that is the squeegee will be worn. So you have to take sandpaper and a nice straight edge. We keep a special piece of wood to allow the squeegee to move back and forth on very fine sandpaper to sharpen that edge. So the operator will look and see that that's okay. We don't have any little pieces of sandpaper left over, so you have to make sure that the edge is clean, and then you can pull that ink across the screen and it will print. Then you have to have someone to either lift the screen up to access the paper, or you have to have that pedal we put in with a weight on the end of a pulley that pulls the screen up, so you push with your foot and the screen comes up and the paper can be eliminated. Then your paper remover has to be careful to move with fresh ink on it, and it has to be dried. If the ink is too wet, it will dribble when you hang it on the linen line. But then you have someone who takes that paper and hangs it on the linen line. And that person is rather important because he or she is the person who will pick up glitches. So if there's a leak in the side or something like that, then there's a lot of shouting with this sort of activity. It's kind of fun, but you have to stop the process and wash that little portion of the silkscreen so that you can then put glue on it, and you have to have a hairdryer to dry it quickly, and in the meantime your ink may be drying, so you have to be moving quickly, and that's part of having the team do this. And so now comes the second image, and you hope that you have it registered properly. And in this case, you're going to have the first image with a light grayish for a black background, and then we're going to lay on the details with a somewhat darker material or ink, or it can be paint sometimes. And so with a little bit of hope, we register the second image. Doesn't always work. You have prints that are artist's proofs. That means that the artist has been experimenting to get this print underway. So now you have to imagine that once you've dried the image for the second time, and you can put it into the press without it bleeding onto the press and making ridiculous marks on it, you then have the third image, and if you're very lucky, they're all in place, and they're all hung on the linen line, and there we are. You can do this in a closed space, but you have to have evacuation, because the volatile materials that we use for the ink are rather stringent, and you can sort of get almost high on the fumes if you're not careful. So we have to evacuate the air, and you still have screens that are damp that are on the linen line, and they produce a little bit of volatile material into the air too. So it behooves you to have a place to do this, and I have to say that you can do it out of doors if you're lucky. But if you have a windy day with a little dust, you're going to get dust across your silkscreen. You're going to get an insect here and there, or so. Although we do rough, tough signs in the street, and it works, if you're doing a refined art print, you need to have it in an area where you don't have an ant or a creature that gets in the way. You can solve the problem. You can find the ant and eliminate it. But once again, that means you stop the process. So theoretically, we should take our print machine out to a warehouse where we have some protection and can work with it without these sorts of glitches. So now that is not the end of it. We usually do about 100 prints at a time. When you're selling art prints, you don't want so many around that everyone sees the same image when they turn around the corner. So it's called a limited edition. And so each print has to have a number. So you put them in order, and you have perhaps 5 or 6 artist proofs, and then you have the real deal. And then buyers will buy according to the number. This is more important when you have engravure or where you're dealing with metal that wears. But as you silkscreen, the pores of the silk get to be filled in a little, and so some people would prefer to buy a softer print that has been towards the end of the run. Some people very much like to buy the first prints where the squeegee is crisp and the ink hasn't filled in on the pores, and so it's important to have a number, and so you have a number 27 over 100, which is listing how many prints. So if you are doing a very detailed piece of artwork and you only have 5 prints, you would say print number 1 of 5 prints. But we're sending a message to people, and that tree became a go-between for talking to the community and to the state conservation people about the need to look at this pond as a vernal pond that should be preserved. And that print, when it was finished, actually did have a tremendous effect on what the community did with this little pond that was part of their history of a zigzag railroad. And that's what we do with our prints, and often it's quite successful. It might be a bird strip with a row of corn left, and the high contrast image there would be imagery that young children especially look on, and they can see a giraffe and they can see all sorts of other things that are interesting to see in that image. And you never really knew that was going to happen. So it's interesting to see how people interpret what you do. So you don't necessarily tell people this story of how you make a silkscreen print. You tend to let your viewers find out for themselves and interpret for themselves. There are more direct screens that might have a more cartoon type image where you're going to know that you're sending a message, and it's not going to change very much with a viewer. But so we now have a stack of prints, and that part of the problem is that if you're going to run 100, you have to have 100 prints, and you have to store them in some place. And that's where we come into conflict with the computer era that can take an image, and not unlike what we're doing, and store it so that you can order up 1 or 2 prints at a time. So you don't have this huge storage problem. So we have about 30 different images, and they can fill a warehouse if you have to. And in things like offset press, the same sort of thing had to happen. If you were going to make a copy of a thesis, you had to make 10 copies at a time. You couldn't go back and make another copy or order another copy off of the computer. So the industry has changed a lot. You also have to know that OSHA, the federal organization that looks at well health, has gotten into the act of looking at the materials that artists use. Artists aren't necessarily technocrats, and so sometimes there have been poisonous materials that are used for art. It might include a little bit of lead or some mercury or some of those things that you get high on are familiar to artists, and they're very much a part of their home. To move into an art studio and smell the materials is interesting, but sometimes it's commercial people that have a problem. It used to be that you were making a clock face. You could take a brush and put radioactive material there so that you could see watch face at night. And the people who were doing that were making the point of their brush very fine by putting it in their mouth and picking up the material. And after a while it was realized that that was not the thing you did with that particular material. So there has been a cleaning up of the art industry so that it has materials that are less volatile and less stringent. So there is some background to this. You also have to sign this print, and this can be a problem if you have a team of people working on a print. It might be that you might need to put 3 or 5 signatures on the same print. Now, Michelangelo and others would do that, you use apprentices, and they didn't always give credit to the people who were doing a lot of the background work. It's also very difficult because it's much simpler to sell and deal with artwork if you have one person on the signature list. It's the same for the computerization. You have to be able to go to the computer and find the real artist. The real artist is probably the person who took the picture in the first place and got the concept together. So you can do that, but it's often very kind to have the people that are involved in the process also involved in the picture in the first place. So if we were doing a removal of wood out of an elevator, and there was a team of people knowing where the nails were so that they could saw down the wood, and we could sell it as ricks of lumber, then those people were involved from the get-go. And it's nice to involve those people also in the printing and also in the selling. So back to the signature again. If you're working with silkscreen prints, you have to sign it in pencil. The reason for that is that it's very easy to put the signature on your photograph and print the signature, which doesn't give it the qualification that is needed for the art sale industry. So signing it with a pencil is important. It usually should be a softest pencil that we could do it with a hard pencil, but it's rather important that the signature be along the bottom of the print. In some cases where we are dealing with color photographs, we'll put the signature in the photograph, and we'll make it in a yellow color or a soft pastel color so that you hardly see the signature, because the signature can sometimes violate the picture. You don't want people to see the signature first. You're looking for them to see the image. So people remember these images, and they kind of like them. I encounter people who are going to a retirement village, and guess what? They're taking their picture that they bought many years ago to with them. Sometimes I'll find a picture in a second-hand store, and I'll buy it because its value is more than it's recognized at a second-hand sale. But this sort of activity has helped us to talk to people about prairie preservation, about forest preservation. The tree we were talking about has had an impact, and we still have these silk screen prints, these silk screens, and it's very tempting to redo them, but it's a little bit in for a dig to do that. Weft has produced a nice, and David has been involved with this a lot, and Ed Hadley made a very nice image of the Prairie Monk on the prairie with a background picture of Monk looking over the prairie. And that print was an award for people donating at least 90.1 FM radio contribution. It would be very tempting to take that rather helpful image and sell it for $15 or something like that. But that would be rather cruel to the people who have donated more generally. And so we're beholden to not reproduce that image again. So it's confined to those people who were helpful. And the same goes for most of our prints. We didn't quite know what to do with color. Color is very important. Color for paper is a little bit like the color that comes for cars or refrigerators. There are colors that are seasonal. It's like names. Like certain names get to be popular in a certain era. I grew up in a place called Thora, and Thora was a name for a woman's name in a certain era. You don't encounter it much anymore, but it's so. Color is important, but color can also be rather wonderful. We had people who had a bedroom with all Monkian prints were yellow, the black printed on yellow. Then you can do a reverse. You can print white on black. And so we had Allerton Park prints in the era when Allerton Park was in jeopardy of being a Springfield reservoir. That white image on black is almost very different. It almost looks like you are looking at the Chicago skyline in the middle of the night. So once again, we're involving people's imagination. So color can also kill your picture. If the color is too dramatic, then you don't see the imagery very well. And we at Stouts didn't know whether this is a different run. Do you look at a different color with as a different run? So there's all sorts of questions there. And you have to know that in the background there's the law. And the law says that if you violate the buyer of a silkscreen print by it leaking on the edges, or by having a signature that's not correct, or that the buyer gets to be recompensed 3 times the price of what he paid for the print. We didn't exactly go for high prices, and we didn't get involved with the law, but some silkscreen artists are spending months and months to do a very unique print, and they're the sort of people who are watched by people who are in the art industry to know whether you're doing the right thing by the art buyer. Let me see. Oh, well, you got the idea of a silkscreen print and what we do with it. It's we hope to get to you with a season's greetings. If we don't, we wish you, as you get together, have fun and enjoy, and we'll be back to you as the new year comes on. But it's been fun to be doing this and working with people and to talk to them at the mall, and I've really much appreciated that. And I think David does too. He's been helping us do these sorts of things for a long time, and so also before that, Bill Saylor has been a party to this. So a lot of this is teamwork, and a lot of it is talking to other people, and I do enjoy doing that. So I think it's time. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and it's kind of late to be doing... Oh, first I should just say the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.